Okay, good evening, everybody, and sorry for the technology issues, but we're back on with Teams. It looks like Dr. Weinberger is just now joining the call. So we have a couple of items here on our agenda. The first of which is to discuss the existing homework policy. This topic was brought to the policy committee's attention through board member De Palma, who was asking for some additional information on the amount of time elementary students in particular were spending on their Chromebooks or laptops beyond the regular school day, which for many students is on the Chromebook to begin with. So we have attached in this agenda a copy of the homework policy, which was last adopted in 2008. And we're going to ask Dr. Case and Ms. Goss to speak for a few minutes about what the content is in the homework policy.
Thank you, Dr. Costanzo. I'm going to ask Janine Goss is going to talk a little bit about the homework policy, the existing board policy. Janine?
Okay. You all have the homework policy in front of you. So I think what I'll do is sort of summarize the key points. As Dr. Costanzo said, this was adopted back in 2008, and it is under the umbrella of instruction, and it's referencing homework and makeup work. So the message here is that it is the district's responsibility to educate students, and part of that is the assignment of homework. And they do this through effective classroom instruction.
We can't hear you well. Do you have the headset close to you?
How's this? Can you hear me better? Okay. All right. So homework is a part of the district's responsibility to educate students, and they do this through effective classroom instruction, including independent work. And you'll notice that there is a steady increase in the amount of homework as students progress through the grades. The message also conveys that the work provided should be related to what is taught in school. It's a review. And as part of the policy, it says that students are provided with meaningful opportunities to practice and apply what they've learned during the day, and that the work is both developmentally as well as instructionally appropriate. It also notes that there is differentiation opportunities for our English learners, as well as the accommodations of students with 504 plans, as well as IEPs. You may also see long-term projects included in homework, and those are supported by the teacher with clear phases and expectations. The policy also states that homework is not to be used as a punishment, nor should it be removed, rather, as a reward. And the policy also notes a partnership, a three-way partnership between families, staff, as well as students, and that it is an expectation that families go ahead and provide students with time to do their best work in a space either at home or in another location, and ensuring that the work assigned is beneficial. So we want students to view homework as an important part of their development, and there is an intrinsic satisfaction from it. And that really is a summary of the policy that was put in place back in 2008.
Thank you, Janine. And
Thank you, Janine. So of course the policy has been in existence and it has not been updated, and we are living in very special times. So what we did was we surveyed a number of the elementary schools to see what they were doing now, at the present time. And we surveyed most of those schools. And most are actually trying to adapt their current situation to the board, to the existing board policy. Most schools that we talk to are having students review materials learned, so they're staying with that. They've kind of established, even though there are no time frames established in the board policy as it exists, they've established some shorter time frames. For example, in kindergarten through second grade, we saw that there was a range from about 5 to 10 minutes of work. and maybe up to 30 or 35 minutes for the upper elementary. And of course, they are focusing on reading and math. But most schools are giving computerized tasks. So, and with, in some cases, independent reading. So students are on the computer during the day, all day long, for regular core instruction. And then most of the homework that is being given is on computer as well. So one school, though, is not is not giving any computerized homework. What they're asking the children to do is approximately 20 minutes of reading. And the reading can be in books. They also have access to some digital libraries, like Mayan, or some of the schools are using a digital library called Raz Kids. And this school believes strongly that students are looking at computers too long during the day, that they're on the screen too much. And they believe that young students have to move. They have to be able to get up and move, and they don't need to be tied to, a computer program. So when we looked at these schools that are giving homework after school and are using the computer programs, they're using things like Symphony Math and Newsella. One school is using something called Lexia. And most are using continuation of school tasks. So if the student didn't finish during the day, during the regular core instruction, they would continue to finish online after school. We called a number of districts around Connecticut to see what they were doing, whether or not any of the other school districts that are, in Connecticut had done anything about homework during this time. And I know our staff spoke to Stamford and Stratford and Darien and Wilton, Ridgefield, Weston. And those districts, only 2 of those districts had a revised policy. And their policy was reading only, 20 minutes of reading. So our schools are trying to do, I think, the best they can at this particular point. They still see that the policy is in existence. There is a policy in existence. So they're trying their best to adapt to that policy. But again, the students are online all during the day, continuously. And then the homework that those schools who are administering homework are giving online homework as well. So that's where we are in terms of the current situation.
A clarifying question.
Yes.
In terms of some of the research you got from schools now, in-person students are on the devices for the same length of time remote learners are, or is that different?
No. So all of our elementary schools are teaching synchronously, excuse me. And that means that the students at home are on computer while the students in school are on computer. And the teachers are working with both. I mean, there may be some small grouping during the classroom instruction, but the students are on. So both groups of students are on the computer for core instruction. Now, can a student turn their computer off for a particular period of time? I guess it's possible, but generally the instruction is computer-based. Does that answer your question, right, Godfrey?
Yeah, I just wanted to know if there was a distinction between the 2 cohorts, but thank you, Alex. Both cohorts are on, in-person remote are on for the same duration of time.
Right. I mean, that was the superintendent's expectation for the whole district, and I think the elementary schools are really working hard to make sure that that.
Thanks for answering the question.
This would be a good time if there are other board members that have questions about either a review of the existing policy or Dr. Case's review of past and current practices as it relates to homework at the elementary level.
So if I can jump in, I think some of the voiceover that you had run through with regards to what schools are doing and how they're administering or asking for homework. So I heard a lot of inconsistency at the school level. And my fear is that that type of inconsistency is what leads to inequities, especially when we're talking about some schools assigning homework on computers and other schools not assigning homework on computers and just doing reading. The AAP has pointed to a homework gap, not even outside of the pandemic as it relates to homework assigned on computers. So I would love to see, and I know Frank, you and I have had some conversation in the background about policy versus procedure, but I think this is exactly why districts like Ridgefield move from procedure into policy to really put a definition around the time and the type of homework at each grade level and how it was administered to ensure that there was equity and we were closing that homework gap, if you will.
I think as one of the things we have to.
Can you guys mute yourself when you're not on?
I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind that makes Norwalk different from other districts is that we have programming diversity. So although we have to think about how we are immersing ourselves in conversation around what homework should look like at within our schools, we also have to understand that we have unique programs with different philosophical approaches that also impact the way the schools see homework and the way homework plays out in practice. So although we're living in the reality of a pandemic right now, and we have to take measures to modify what we're doing, we also want to be careful that whatever decisions we make do not negatively interfere with the philosophical approaches that different schools have that lend to the diversification of programming across the district. Usually when there is a unilateral or uniform policy, like Richfield and other places, the program diversity that we have in Norwalk usually does not exist. So as we think about the work today and what modifications within like a procedural structure we want to apply, we want to be cognizant that one of the things that is a highlight for us as Norwalkers, however I want to say it, is that we have the luxury of having program diversity, and parents have the choice of having their children in diversified learning models. And we don't want to, through a policy or procedure, limit the school's flexibility in making sure that their homework design aligns with their philosophical approach.
Do you have a sense of the homework itself could be diverse, but the time allotment at the grade level could be consistent? Because I think a lot of what we've heard from parents is that the homework is just stacking and there's really no vigilance, over how much is being assigned, especially when you've got different teachers, at the middle school level, and it's compounding and nobody's, overseeing that at an enterprise level.
Yes.
So
May I just add just quickly that I believe that Stanford, which was one of the school districts that we called, they have not revised their homework policy, and they have not put anything in writing for schools across their district. And I'm looking at Stanford as being, of all the districts I mentioned, being the one that is the closest in size and in diversity to Norwalk.
So Erica, I guess my question to you is the homework concern more about, can you mute?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Is the homework concern more about homework in general, even pre and post COVID, or is it within COVID, given the amount of screen time that students are engaging in, plus homework? Like, I think it would be helpful to know if the challenge is the amount of time allotted, regardless of whether we're in the pandemic or not, or is it something that we want to put into consideration at this point, given the pandemic?
Yeah, I think there's two tracks of the conversation. My flagging the homework during the pandemic was directly related to the fact that, especially at the elementary school level, we've got kids that are stationary most of the day. There's not the same amount of movement breaks that we've seen historically. They're abruptly switching to a significant amount of time on devices, and then in some instances, in some schools, we're asking them to continue that screen time at home. And what I've read is that it potentially is something that we should have a conversation with Dr. Weinberger about as it relates to children's eye health. Separately and apart from that, I thought it was time for us to have a conversation about homework in general, because the policy is very loose and it's not as tight as some of the other districts that I've seen in our area as it relates to time specifically. And of course, there's this ongoing debate in the background about how valuable homework is. Is there truly a positive, correlation or with homework and achievement at the elementary school, and then a separate conversation about any positive correlations at the middle and high school level, because of course those do need to be differentiated conversations. So two separate tracks. One is an immediate need just based on the amount of time that we're asking our little ones to be on the computers right now during remote learning, in consideration of the fact that they're in their seats all day just staring at these computers.
Okay, so for the purposes of today's conversation, can we focus? I think that we need to have multiple conversations then about this topic, but for the purposes of today, can we focus the conversation on homework within the pandemic, and maybe narrowing it down to elementary school and focusing on that element of the work, and then have subsequent conversations about other grade bands, just so that we can reach some level of deeper conversation around where we want to head and what we want to do. I don't know what the group thinks, but I think if we take it in chunks.
I think that makes good sense. And we're at 6:03, so we do have Dr. Weinberger on the call. We haven't had the opportunity to hear about his thinking around homework during the pandemic, screen time, et cetera. So, Dr. Weinberger, we'd love to hear what you have to say about this topic.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me. This is a particularly interesting subject to me as a pediatrician, because we spend a lot of time talking to families about media and about time spent, and here we are, and it's all blown up. I want to discuss a little bit about a research paper that was done by Denise Pope, who's a co-founder of an institute at Stanford University that looks at education. And she surveyed 200,000 middle school children about, if you had anything to change right now, what would you change? And they said homework. It's a huge stressor. And there's enough stress in kids' lives. We're talking all the time about, during this time of the pandemic, about the trauma and the stress that children are going through, and how important it is to alleviate as much stress as possible. And so certainly homework is one of those. In a study that they did of 500,000 high school students between October 2018 and 2020, 56% of the students said that there was too much homework. And when they looked at this, there was an average of about 2.7 hours of homework during the week and 3.0 hours on weekends. Ultimately, when we looked at all this, the consensus was there's probably no reason in elementary school to do any homework except for reading for pleasure. And that crosses all bounds. We as pediatricians spend a huge amount of time talking to parents of pregnant women mothers of newborns, fathers of newborns, about the importance of engaging with their children and spending time. If we could get elementary school kids to be reading to their parents and engaged with their parents for 20 minutes a day, that would be a huge plus to the school system. And I don't even care what language it is. I think it's just important that kids read for pleasure and engage their parents in that process. Middle school, high school kids, it really depends on all of the things you're talking about what's the purpose of the homework, that it shouldn't be just busy work. It should have some focus and some extent. It should be something that might be a continuation of what they're doing in class. It's something that maybe they can help do independently. But just to do homework for homework is a waste of time. My background is I come from a little steel mill town where you went home with blue papers and you had to do blue papers, and that was just a waste of time. Anyhow, that's my thought. Screen time, everybody, there's policy statements all over the place by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And this just gone out the window. We just have to be very attuned to what the kids are watching. And that includes what they're doing, the Chromebooks and social media and all the problems that is. So that's my thoughts.
To that end, in the papers that I've read, the screen time is not only what we are asking them to attend to while they're in the school day and potentially their homework, if we choose to continue, in some schools with screen time homework. Parents are also during the pandemic leaning more into devices to, help the fact that they're home, their children are home. We're trying to multitask, and we're seeing more parents, put their kids in front of devices to try to help offset the fact that we're multitasking in this current situation.
To that point, if you have not watched it, Netflix has a docudrama about the social dilemma and what how the tech companies have made social media just invasive. They're actually very scary.
I wonder if when looking at how we're addressing this conversation at elementary level, being mindful that achieving, being a one-to-one district, and understanding, what that will look like at the end of COVID. I think there is richness and merit in really being able to at least address or a time limit around the screen time, because for my own kids, their vision has regressed. Since COVID, before the year, within 3 months, I went to the doctor and was clearly the regression was huge, and when I think about it, there's nothing else that they were doing for the school day. And, before knowing concretely, how it looks or putting parameters on individual schools' use of technology during the school day, I think, having a conversation geared towards limiting screen time per day, or even breaking up consecutively, would be a good start, or at least part of the discussion.
I just want to say that in terms of the conversations that we've been having with the expectation around synchronous instruction is not that the child is in front of a screen at all times. It is a tool for kids to interface and engage with other students that are at home. The idea is that they're getting work and working on group activities, reading activities that are not always on a monitor. I think that as people are getting acclimated to the new realities of how teaching and learning has to be rolled out given the environment that we're living in, it's easier to resort to utilizing the screen as the medium of instruction. But in reality, when we're talking about synchronous instruction, if we have all of us Let's say we have people right now at home and others in person. The idea is that children will be able to interface with one another in dialogue and conversation while they're working on tasks that are provided for them that don't necessarily have to be on a screen. I think that as people are acclimating and getting accustomed to the new approach of teaching, they're grappling with what seems more practical. And part of the work that I think we as a district have to engage in is pushing the thinking around what the synchronous looks like to minimize the amount of screen time. And it's something that we're going to be discussing October 12th during professional learning, because I think it's really important that teachers understand that the idea of synchronous instruction is not that a child is constantly learning on a monitor. The monitor is a tool to connect children at home with children in the classroom, but the resources don't have to be on a device and shouldn't be on a device all the time. On that note, in terms of homework, I'm wondering if part of the policy that we can, policy procedure that we can potentially put on the table is the possibility of setting up parameters that any task that is assigned should not be on a device, and maybe reinforcing the piece, which I think is crucial, is providing children with reading time every night, especially at elementary school level. I think that's something that is critical for children's developing, obviously age appropriate, and even considering maybe not assigning homework within certain grade bands within elementary. Because even within elementary, developmentally, what we ask students to do is very different. Let's say in kindergarten through second grade versus third grade to fifth grade, right? What's developmentally appropriate varies significantly within the different grade bands. So besides thinking about time restrictions, right? Because we can set a time guidance that homework shouldn't be more than 15 minutes. But when we say that, 15 minutes for Erica might be 40 minutes for Janine, right? The concept of time is relative to the individual. So I want to be careful how we define that, because depending on the child and their needs, time becomes becomes irrelevant, because it might mean different things for different children. I think if we focus on the type of task that we're asking children to do, and that we take into consideration, if we're considering time, that we take into consideration that every child does not take the same amount of time to complete a task.
So, I'm sorry, were you finishing up? Okay. So, I'll just go on record that I'm completely on board with the, no homework in elementary school policy. Especially now, I've done a tremendous amount of reading on this topic, and there hasn't been a lot of, correlations that point to, why we would extend the day into homework and why we would add that element of stress outside of reading. The second part of your position, though, is something that I think I would like to continue the conversation on outside of COVID, as it relates to the time that's spent, because I hear you, a certain task would take one child 5 minutes, another child 30 minutes, but I've read the same Stanford paper that Dr. Weinberger was pointing to, and they also flagged a point of diminishing returns if that homework extends, too far out. So if we do have children that are spending 45 minutes on homework that was intended to be 20 minutes, because that's the amount of time that's good for their well-being and their stress levels, then that's, could be the reason why those time parameters are put into place in other districts.
But I think there's the concept of quality versus quantity. So you might have a task that has 10 different prompts, And some children can easily engage in them within like 10 to 15 minutes. Some other children can complete 3 to 5 components of the same task within that time frame. So giving them more doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting more. So it's also thinking about when we set parameters within tasks, how do we set expectations that are differentiated based on the child's need? Because we talk about the fact that we have diverse learners, but within diverse learners, we have to have diverse parameters in terms of how we scaffold instruction for them. And something to take into consideration is how do we scaffold tasks based on what we know about the child and how much of an extended experience will be appropriate for them given the amount of time it might take them to engage in that task. And within our policy, it already talks about homework being a collaboration between the family and the school. So if a parent reaches out and expresses that concern that the task is taking X amount of time and the school interpreted the task taking a third of that time, then how do we engage in that collaborative discussion in modifying the task for the child so that the child is exposed to the rigor of the standard, but at the same time is immersed in a practice that is developmentally appropriate for that child?
Isn't that talking about individualized curriculum?
Well, I don't know. I'm getting in part, yes, and that's part of why some children have an individualized plan. The question is how. I don't know. The question is how are we practicing that systematically, and are we practicing it? Because within a child's IEP, those modifications, Dr. Weinberg, might be present, but I don't know how we as a system are practicing that approach.
And I think that's a challenge is, what is in procedure, and policy, is it being implemented in practice? And I think there needs to be a certain awareness that we've heard from parents that it's not necessarily being put into practice and that the homework is compounding. We heard it was loud and clear, and I know you didn't have the benefit of this, Dr. Estrella, but when the Healthy Start conversations were at the height, of those discussions, many parents, raised the amount of homework that they were getting at the middle school and high school level and how this impacted this. Now, those two things are separate and apart, but it did allow for, a secondary issue to bubble up to the top, outside of this pandemic, and, how this policy is being put into practice.
I'd like to say something. We definitely need to keep in mind the different grade levels and programs. First of all, screen time. We also have to take into consideration, a lot of times they're not on the screen. For example, if they're in art class, if they're in gym, if they are taking photography, they are talking, but they are not doing work on the screen. During gym, they're doing exercises outside or wherever their computer is with them. During art, they're drawing, they're creating, they're just using the screen to show. So we have to take all those other classes into consideration in screen time. Then when you come to high schoolers, you have these programs like Global Studies and P-TECH, where again, they are either in college classes. They're not just regular classes where you can say you're only allowing 20 minutes of homework when they have to do a coding program or software program where, yes, they are having all those extra hours. However, it was that child's choice and the family's choice to get that extra homework in to be able to graduate with a degree. So I think as we move forward, we need to take into consideration, talk to the different teachers, programs, admins, students, before we can just say we're going to either cut this or cut that and really take everyone and listen to everyone. And the other thing I know, Erica, you and I have had conversations with families is the holidays, especially the Jewish holidays, where parents are saying my child shouldn't get homework during this time because, we're fasting, we're home, we shouldn't be doing anything. So in consideration of timing, we should look at the calendar and have some holidays in there to discuss too.
That's one of the reasons, Diana, that, just hold on, that we set the holidays, that not necessarily that we are off, but all the major holidays, religious and other celebratory holidays in the calendar, because we wanted teachers to be cognizant of when they were coming up, to be considerate of what they were assigning students to do. So I think as a follow-up, and I don't know, Dr. Case, how you feel, I think we need to have some deeper conversations of what are some of the, given the certain philosophical approaches of the schools, what are some of the things that we need to modify within, starting with elementary, in terms of the current procedures around homework. Particularly, I think for this situation is, like I said earlier, continuing having reading every single night, but limiting homework to almost, honestly, to no homework at this point for the young children. I think for middle school and high school, because of the complexity of the standards involved and the kind of work and practice that they need to embed, we would need to have a follow-up conversation and policy around what parameters we need to take into consideration. I think the curriculum and instruction team has to have additional conversations with the school leaders and teachers about what are the things that have been working, what are some of the feedback that they've been hearing from parents around the middle school and high school perspective, because it's very different. Even with school students that are engaging in early college, a lot of the parameters around homework we don't control because the college usually controls those dynamics. So I think the conversation is more complex at the middle and high school level. But I think for elementary school, I don't know how the group feels. We can set up a procedure that talks about providing reading time, and until the pandemic concludes, no homework for students in elementary grades.
I think that's, from my perspective, very smart. I think it takes into account the fact that those children are stationary, during the day. They don't have the benefit of even passing in the halls, as movement breaks. And there's a technology gap when they get home. These little guys don't necessarily know how to navigate homework on their own without the support of a parent that they benefit from in the classroom, or when their teacher isn't in front of them virtually in remote learning. And of course, there's the wellness aspect of their eye health.
So I like your suggestion, Dr. Estrella, and a point of clarification, earlier when I was referencing the regression around my own child, the concern came from the place of remote learning at home, not, a screen time around. It was just a consecutive piece of that. And I don't know how far out philosophically or culturally, that extends into the home for those remote learners, which changes just, just the expectation for what's being assessed around home, and being mindful of the time we are now, and what the anticipated future looks like. This suggestion, I think, really removes a layer, in my opinion, layer stress, off of parents, because there's a readiness to allocate time to make sure your child's situated, whether it's for homework, remote learning, and in times of added stress, it becomes an even bigger stressor placed on kids, because parents are living with their expectation and understanding of homework as they grew up, and there's some type of graded feedback, and the lack of the absence of a clear policy or procedure to speak to what's expected that everyone understands, I think really continuously impacts just some of the dichotomies at home that pushes up front. I also want to say that, I know Heidi's not here, but being mindful of any input she has, I thought that would be important to capture. But again, I'm in favor of your idea, and that's all I have to say.
I think one of the things that we can do is at the next policy meeting, have a follow-up conversation about it. The only challenge is that we would have to wait several weeks before we can start having conversations with principals about it. So I'll have a follow-up discussion with Heidi about the conversation here tonight and get her insight. And then from that discussion, then have subsequent conversations with the elementary school principals around their thoughts and perspective, which I know Dr. Case already started, so that we can finalize a procedure expectation around homework for the duration of the pandemic.
Dr. Estrella, would it make sense to have, and I don't even know if you need to do this, right, under the current policies, of an ad hoc meeting to finalize this? Because I would hate to go another month and, have that stress put on those elementary school students and their parents if we don't have to.
That's what I'm saying, that we wouldn't. I'll have
Okay.
I'll have a conversation with Heidi at some point tomorrow, and with the goal that we can have something finalized by the end of this week.
And just to remind the board, back at the July Board of Ed retreat, there was that COVID pandemic policy that was passed that granted a special administrative authority to the superintendent on policy matters that really shouldn't be applying during the pandemic. So I think the superintendent can have a conversation with Heidi and make a decision on homework for the duration of the pandemic without having to get into the formal policy as it's currently constructed on paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for the purposes of this, Frank, I don't foresee this becoming policy, but more of a procedure, just because of the temporary nature of the matter. Because like we said earlier, we would have to have subsequent conversations about the long-lasting plan of action around homework that would definitely impact. Hold on, let me just mute. That will definitely impact policy in the long term. So I think for the purposes of this, what we're talking about right now, just to clarify, we're going to create a procedure for the pandemic, not necessarily a policy. But we can then have, I don't know, obviously the committee can decide on this. Once we decide what we're going to do for the pandemic and the procedures moving forward, we can have subsequent conversations about what does homework look like long-term for us as a district, and we can add that as part of our strategic operating plan as we continue to have those conversations within the next few months, so that it becomes something that is embedded into the work that we will be doing as a district as we continue to redefine our path for the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And I think, God willing, we won't be in a position where we're still in the pandemic at the end of the school year. But if we are, we'll have to get in front of the fact that our fifth graders will be transitioning to middle school, and how do we prepare them for homework in the next year, since they would potentially be going the entire year without homework and just the reading and maybe homework optional.
So we are at the 6:30 mark. Before Godfrey adjourns the meeting, one thing we neglected to do, because I think the tech issues, was the approval of minutes. And Maura had sent electronically to the board members the last set of minutes from the last policy committee meeting. We can either defer the approval of those minutes until the next policy meeting, or if you want to go a little over time, you can review those and decide to approve or amend those minutes now and then adjourn.
Prefer.
Okay, so we'll tack on the approval of those minutes to the next policy committee meeting. It'll be a combination of tonight's minutes and the last meeting minutes. Thank you to Dr. Weinberger for being on the call tonight. We appreciate your time, and thanks to our curriculum I said consultants, colleagues. It's been a long day. And thanks.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.